He jumped 21.5 feet, so he made it up there. So what I found is the simplest coaching seems to be the best coaching. So Paul has laid an extremely high standard down. Now he's going to give us some coaching in verse 2. What he tells us is this. He says that we need to be transformed. And that's the second way that we please God, is by being transformed. He says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but by renewing your mind, be transformed. Now, he uses some Hebrew poetry here where he says, don't do this, but instead do this. And it's something you see in Proverbs a lot. So let's look at that first part. He says, don't conform any longer to the pattern of the world. When Paul talks about the world, he doesn't mean earth. He means the part of creation that's opposed to God. We cannot be opposed to God as Christians. We can't put ourselves in situations where we're opposed to God. So we don't want to be like the world. And it's easy to do that if we're not focusing on God. The word conform there is interesting because it can be either deliberate or it can be accidental or passive. Paul's saying don't purposely try to be like the world, but don't take your eyes off God and accidentally be like the world. And I think an illustration that might help here is imagine your life as a building. And every day that you live, another floor is built or another room is added. No building is built without a blueprint. Nothing is built without some architect designing it. God has a plan for your life. He has a way he wants the building of your life to look. The world also has a plan for your life. And what Paul is saying is, if you're not going to focus on God, you're going to be built the way the world wants you to be built. And that's going to be opposed to God. Now, Misty and I have been building a playset for our kids the last couple of weeks. It's got lots of wood, lots of screws, lots of bolts. I would have no hope of building that without a blueprint, without some sort of instructions. And to be honest, even with the instructions, it's been really, really hard. So Paul doesn't just leave us with that, saying, well, don't be like the world, and leave us there with nothing. What he says is, by renewing your mind, be transformed. Now, he doesn't tell us what to be transformed into, but I think we can guess that we should be transformed into the likeness of Christ. Paul talks about being crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives through me. And the way we do that is by renewing our minds. You renew your mind when you pray, instead of complaining about things or just wishing things would get better. You renew your mind when you read the Word, when you read the Bible. And again, if we want to find the blueprint for our lives, it's going to be in the Bible. You renew your mind when you serve others selflessly. You renew your mind when you share the gospel. And as we renew our mind, God will transform us into the likeness of His Son. God will make us like Christ. Now that word renew is the word we would use for remodel. And again, I think it's a really good illustration. If we've been following the world and are built like the world wants us to be, we need to be remodeled. We need God to tear out everything that wasn't supposed to be there and build us up the way we're supposed to look. And again, we're supposed to look like Christ. So as we pull ourselves out of the world and renew our minds, God will make us like Christ. So the first way we please God is by offering our bodies as a living sacrifice that's holy and pleasing. The second way we please God is by being transformed. You cannot offer your life as a sacrifice if you want what the world wants. You cannot offer your life as a sacrifice if you act like the world acts. You cannot offer your life as a sacrifice if you don't look like Christ. And as we said, if we can't offer ourselves as a sacrifice, we can't please God. But Paul doesn't leave us there either. Paul says, offer your life as a sacrifice. Check, I can do that. Be transformed. Check, I can do that. Even though we're giving God something, God's going to give us something in return. Because at the end of verse 2, Paul says this. He says that we will be able to test and approve the will of God, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So when we're transformed, we're going to know God's will. And that's something that especially young Christians, we want to know God's will for our life. I spoke with my brother-in-law just a couple weeks ago at lunch. He wants to know God's will for his life. My answer now would be, you have to be transformed. And I'm not trying to make God sound like a crystal ball. This doesn't mean that you're sitting down at the table thinking about what you have to do, and suddenly you hear a voice or you see words appear on the wall. Think back to being transformed. If I'm transformed into the likeness of Christ, I'm going to think like Christ. I'm going to look at the world the way Christ looks at it. One commentator says that as we're transformed, we're going to see God at work in our lives, and we're going to see God at work in the lives of others. That's how we'll know God's will. We used to have bracelets and t-shirts that said WWJD, what would Jesus do? And we'd all stop and think real hard for a minute about what Jesus would do. What Paul is saying is if we're transformed, we're going to do what Jesus would do naturally. That's going to be a part of us. That's going to be what we want to do. Paul also talks about this plan. He says it's God's good will, God's pleasing will, God's perfect will. It's good because it builds His kingdom. It's pleasing, and again,